when I got started with learning about cloud security, one of the biggest things I didn't understand was the way that the infrastructure and everything else behind it works. In my head, like everything just kind of runs off of like, like a server with like a
Right.
big hard drive, and like you just rent that and then everything's good. So as soon as I started learning about cloud security, I learned that that is not the case. That's only the case for maybe a couple types of these models. But there's
Sure.
actually some really interesting stuff around here. And in order to understand how to get started hacking cloud security, you kind of need to understand something called the shared responsibility model, and also how these services work. So, oh, great, it blanks out. I'm using my very favorite program, Keynote, which I'm sure
Ooh.
everyone is a fan of. And here we go. Let me see if I can show this. Okay, so I was watching a bunch of videos on this the other night, and kind of getting spread up on this, and I saw this AWS shared responsibility model. And this is like one of the things you have to understand if you are going to be working with AWS or cloud services, but it goes deeper than that. This is a
Right.
concept that is kind of like deeply ingrained in cloud security, where the shared responsibility model means that the cloud provider is taking something off your hands, and in exchange, like, you need to be aware of the boundary where your responsibility comes in. So
Right.
in the AWS shared responsibility model, the customer is responsible for their data, their platform applications, identity, their access management, operating system, network, firewall, and configuration. All that stuff is the responsibility of the customer, whereas AWS is providing the compute, storage, database, and
Mhm.
networking, regions, availability zones, and edge locations for all their infrastructure, and the security to keep all of that running. So the customer isn't running around worrying about whether or not AWS data centers are secure. Instead, they can
Right.
focus on all the stuff up at the top. Now, that is actually just one shared responsibility model. It turns out that in cloud security, there's a lot of different boundaries where companies might be putting their information and might actually need to look out for security problems. So I wanted to just kind of talk about the various types of cloud infrastructure models, because I thought I knew a lot about this because I worked in technology before. I worked in
Right.
software as a service, and I understand what that means on a marketing sense. But as like a
Right.
back end person, I really didn't understand what it meant. So when it comes to the different models of cloud infrastructure, the first one is infrastructure as a service, and this is basically AWS or like services like
Yeah.
that, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform. This is the kind of thing where you are, as the consumer of this service, basically responsible for almost everything.
Mhm.
They offer hosting for all the stuff that you want to run, but the users have the application, the data, the runtime, and the operating system, whereas the cloud provider is basically managing virtualization, servers, storage, and networking. So in this model, it's like relatively cheap to use these services in
Right.
what you pay the cloud provider, but the cost is you have to basically protect the security of like the operating systems you're running, the applications, and everything all the way down to where the shared responsibility model stops, and or rather shifts over to the cloud provider. So platform as a service is kind of the next step, where you're letting the cloud provider take on a little bit more responsibility. So this is going to be things like Heroku is like one of the most popular platforms as a service for developing like web applications and deploying them.
Mhm.
App Engine, Microsoft Azure App Services. This is for developing like APIs, microservices, and other things that developers need to deploy something relatively quickly. This could be, again, like a backend API or something else that needs to be spun up and maintained relatively quickly. So in this case, the users manage the applications of the data, but the provider is managing basically everything else. So everything the same as before, but also the runtime, the middleware, the OS, and the infrastructure, which they were previously managing. They all now take responsibility for patching that, keeping it updated, and applying like security updates to that underlying infrastructure. So yeah, I kind of made a little bit of a trade here. You're paying more, but you're getting things already
Right.
up for you. And as a developer, you don't want to focus on, like managing the security of your, underlying operating systems and patching that. You just want to focus on your application. So that's really where this kind of structure begins to be useful. All right, so last is software as a service, and this is where I've worked extensively before, and you would recognize this as like Gmail
Right.
or Microsoft 365, Slack, Google Workspace. Like this is the case where the provider is managing everything: applications, data, runtime, OS, and infrastructure, and instead the user of the service is basically just working with the data or otherwise just interacting with it.
Right.
In that case, the provider manages everything: infrastructure, applications, data, runtime, OS, and security. And you can see that when you start to compare these, you can see that this is from Cyber Platter was my teacher for a lot of this, so I have to give her a shout out for like actually being very helpful in teaching me some of these cloud security concepts. But this is the shared responsibility broken down into where the boundary happens, and I think it's cool to kind of think about this green zone. Ironically, is the danger zone. Green means danger, where like this is where like interesting things can happen because there's kind of a gap here where like it, there's maybe default settings left by the cloud provider that the cloud consumer is then left to decide how they want to do it. Like AWS does a default deny in this scenario, whereas infrastructure as a service, they're going to set everything to deny. And you need to go in and decide what parts of the infrastructure are going to be accessible via all this other stuff. But that is also where misconfigurations can cause a real problem. And you can kind of imagine this as like, if something happens down at the bottom, then things up at the top are probably going to be potentially impacted too. So I didn't realize how tied to the infrastructure model cloud security threats are. Depending on what type of model a business is using, that like opens up different opportunities for an attacker. So if you're a hacker just getting started with cloud security, understanding these different models is going to let you know what types of vulnerabilities are going to crop up and what types of things like AWS policy misconfigurations, or maybe something on a platform as a service like a Heroku misconfiguration, what types of vulnerabilities and opportunities that opens up for an attacker. And of course, for a defender, what types of things you're really going to need to keep an eye on to make sure that there's not unintentional leaking of data or potentially allowing attackers inside your network to access too much. So if one of them is compromised, then a lot of stuff can get leaked. So that's my little presentation on cloud infrastructure. I, again, didn't know most of this stuff, amazingly, even though I worked in this field for quite some time. So I have to say, like, for me to have been working in this area that long and not know some of the fundamentals of cloud security was, I guess, startling. But then again, I never really worked with that. I worked with Wi-Fi, hardware, gadgets, that sort of thing. So I think that understanding how the underlying services I'm interacting with are actually set up and where they might be vulnerable and where as a hacker I should start poking around, that's pretty fundamental. So hopefully that taught some people some things about cloud security infrastructure. Killian, you know a lot. I feel like a lot more about this. Did I miss anything really critical you think for beginners to understand?
No, I think that was a great outline. The interesting thing, at least for me, is for whatever reason in my career, I've only ever worked in IaaS or SaaS, but I've never worked in platform as a service for any reason. So it was interesting to see kind of how that sits between them, because it's one of those things when you explained it here, my brain goes, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But then like as soon as the stream is over, I'm going to forget about it because it's not somewhere I spend my time. The other thing too, I think that I'll just really hammer on is with the shared responsibility model. In all cases, it doesn't matter what you're using, IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, or anything else. The data is always the businesses or whoever's responsibility. It will not be the responsibility of the platform provider. And that's a thing that I think gets missed a lot. We talk about some like risk transference when we're going to use the SaaS service, something like that, where, yeah, you can absolutely offload the maintenance of the servers and the patching and whatever else there. Get that off your plate, get off your IT plate, your security team's plate. But I think a lot of times, and hopefully this is changing, but talking to organizations, they think that transfers the risk of protecting the data, and it doesn't, and it never will. And that's a thing that I think we need to be really mindful of the more we adopt it, is whatever the default configurations are, they try and do a pretty good job, at least from what I've seen, but it's still your responsibility. You can't leave that bucket open. You have to know what's in there. You have to know what the exposure level is. Just because it's not your NetApp or whatever it is sharing the data doesn't mean that you're not responsible if something goes wrong.